Hello and welcome back to MLQ Replay. Week 8 is in the books, and we are here to break it all down. Two huge series went down in both the South and North Division with division title implications at stake. And myself, along with Naresh and Ben Mertens, here to discuss it. How you guys doing tonight?
Doing all right. Can't complain.
Good. So we are going to start in the South Division, and obviously we're going to be a little bit limited in our conversations tonight. Obviously, we had some video issues down there in KC. We apologize. We are always trying to make sure we can get you full coverage of every game end to end, and the stats and everything else that accompanies that high end product. And obviously, it was not the case this weekend in KC. But we were able to go off Quadball 1. Obviously look at the scores. But basically, what I really want to posit to you guys is, based on what you can see from the scores, from what's come out of the series, kind of does this really anything you see affect your impressions of these teams and what it means for them at championships? So Ben, I'll throw to you first, and you can really start on either team if you want.
San Antonio won these games by pretty huge margins, which I think we were all expecting them to win this series. But I think putting their foot down like that is in line with what we expected. They held Kansas City relatively lower scoring, I think, as compared, don't quote me on that, but as compared to the Houston series, which was the one nitpick we had, was that in those fast-paced Houston games, they let Houston put up a lot of points too. I think it's hard to tell without film, but these scores are in line with what I would expect, right? San Antonio is at worst a top 3 team in the country. I think Naresh has them as top 1, which I think there's a good case for. So I think these scores are in line with what we'd expect. Kansas City, you would want to see the tape to say something. It looks like they struggled against a team that we expected to be better than them. So I think that's not surprising. What we can't say without a good look at the film is, where do we rank them in that kind of 5 to 8 range now as we head into championships?
Naresh, obviously, as Ben alluded to, you're pretty high on the San Antonio team. So tell me what, from this series, always these numbers excites you as someone who's kind of riding the San Antonio bandwagon.
Yeah, I mean, as Ben mentioned earlier, before we went live, there are some question marks in terms of San Antonio's strength of schedule. But my take is, and the narrative that I need to push is, they're the only team that we've seen so far that's been able to score consistently and efficiently in the half court. And they are also able to do that quickly. That's such an underrated aspect of the sport, in my opinion, in the half court offense, where a lot of teams are in I'm going to be slow, I'm going to be methodical. Oftentimes, dude, you're just slow. You're not doing anything. And every single time I've seen San Antonio play, to be fair, which was one real series, they looked very good doing it. And the scores obviously reflect that they were able to do something very similar against Kansas City in Kansas City, which has been notoriously hard to play the last couple seasons for most teams, as it's known as the Cattle Dome. And this same team, when I say same team, the San Antonio team a couple years ago, they lost to Kansas City a couple seasons ago. I think it was 2022 season. So this is the sort of thing where I think San Antonio just looks like a lot more complete team. They look like they can just throw multiple lines at you without any drop off. And it's just the fact that they can score consistently in the half court that makes, for me, them the favorites over a lot of these other teams.
Yeah, and I think also, they jumped out in most of these games. They had a 6-0 run to start the one game that basically put it away. I think they were up, something like 7-2 in one of the other games very early as well. And, that's something, you want to be able to do in these games for your favorites. You don't want the team to hang around, make it interesting. We're going to get to the North Series, but it's basically the opposite, where Minneapolis jumped out in every single game against Chicago, basically. So, seeing them do that. Also, when we got to actually watch film of them, they were missing some key pieces. Daniel Williams, Miguel Esparza weren't available. And, obviously integrating pieces. It's not as simple as putting a bunch of stars out there. As you mentioned, Naresh, it's about line coherence. We saw a lot of line coherence from them in that first series against Houston. No reason, to think any differently about this series. That said, Naresh, where do you kind of feel, Ben was saying maybe somewhere in that 5 to 8 range. This KC team is obviously going to be second in the South. They're going to get a spot in semifinals. They're either going to be playing, the other two teams actually that we watched this weekend. They're either going to be playing Chicago or they're going to be playing Minneapolis. How do you think they potentially match up in those matches?
Yeah, honestly, I haven't really been impressed with Kansas City the entire summer. I think they got extremely lucky in the Houston series where this flag runner basically ran into the seeker, and it's one of those things where once you get to champs, you're going to expect higher caliber flag runners, and I think the fact that I just don't there's two things with Kansas City for me. I don't trust their seeking enough as of right now. And the other thing was I don't trust their half court at all. From the film, again, the limited film that we have of Kansas City this summer, it felt like they were very streaky, kind of if they're shooting and they're making their shots, look very good. But when they're not hitting those shots, they look kind of whatever. Versus, and to your point of the matchup in this scenario, I don't know if they match up well against Minneapolis at all. So for me, that's like where I come out of it. And if I was a betting man, if you were to rematch Houston and Kansas City on neutral ground, I think Houston is the better team. I think Houston in a 3-game series would beat Kansas City. So for me, have Houston ranked over KC, but that's why every single series, every single game is important. The fact that Kansas City won those games early in the season has them in the 2 seed, automatic ride into the quarterfinals, which is massive, versus Houston, who, again, as much as I might think they're great, they still have to fight through a brutal lower bracket just to play a 1 seed come quarters.
Yeah, for sure. Ben, we all kind of watched and discussed Boston's, shortcomings in that Washington series last week. And how maybe that starts to make, the decision for what is now defined as Chicago and Kenny Murphy and her coaching staff maybe a little bit more interesting. Do you think that that decision's actually gotten that much more interesting, or do you really think there's probably a bit of a difference here between a Boston team and a Kansas City team?
Let me look. Max Havlin has not transferred to Kansas City, so I think it's still a pretty easy decision for Chicago.
Fair enough. Naresh, do you more or less agree?
Yeah, I pretty much agree. That I think when you're having to deal with Max and Lulu on one side, and you get to play at Kansas City that doesn't have a Max and Lulu, you got to choose Kansas City.
No, fair enough. And yeah, that decision will be happening right here on this show next week. So we encourage you to tune in. But I think that's kind of wraps up everything we have about the series. Again, obviously we're a little more limited than we wanted to be, and again we apologize for that. But we do still have an interview for the day, so we're going to bring in Izzy Ramirez, chaser from the San Antonio Soldados. Izzy, thanks so much for taking the time tonight.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to be on here and to talk to you guys today.
Awesome. So, people might not know, you are basically brand new to this sport still. You have not been doing it even a year. You started basically last September, played for Texas State, performed well enough, went all the way to the semifinals, performed well enough to get a well-deserved DA spot with USNT as well. Popped onto this San Antonio team that was immediately a title contender, and are contributing in a big way for them. 9 goals this weekend. I mean, it's a heck of a performance. So I guess talk to me about first just kind of how you got into the sport and kind of what it's been like, this kind of whirlwind through it, up to its upper echelons, basically.
Basically, I've been tempted to get into the sport since my roommate / best friend Bao joined the sport. He started when he was a freshman for Texas State. And every year, every semester, I've been hearing the same thing. Like, you need to come out. Like, you're going to do great. You need to come out. I'm like, no, like, I got to work and everything. And finally, I was like, okay, senior year, I got to get out there for him. I want to play with him. And I ended up making, the closest friends. And I love everyone on my team. And it's really just been really crazy. I didn't know what to expect, honestly, going into the season. But going into, USQ season, it was the best time of my life, being able to travel to Garland and to Virginia. And even though, it didn't end the way we wanted to, the journey was still, it was still great. And, MLQ has been great. I've been playing with, I think, some of the best players in this sport and being able to learn for them. And being able to learn from them has been the best experience. And I think bringing it to Texas State next semester as well is going to be very rewarding for us.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously that Texas State team, very talented, but this San Antonio roster, especially in the quad ball game, and obviously your chaser, kind of a whole nother level. So what was it kind of like, integrating with these players, getting up to the speed of kind of the MLQ game and the way, because I mean, you guys were right from the start. I mean, I remember in that first series you were playing, with David and Hayden, and you guys were clicking and all the passes. And I mean, you'd played with David, but obviously I hadn't played with Hayden. So kind of what was it like, kind of getting up to that speed at the beginning of the summer?
I think definitely going to practice helped a lot. Being able to acclimate to the different speed that MLQ is at and the different level of skill between MLQ and USQ. But I think, going to the practices and learning people's tendencies and how they like to play, and then also taking some of their skills and adding it to my skill set has enabled me to be able to play to that speed and on their level as well.
So obviously, the trip to KC, as Naresh alluded to earlier, has kind of been a pitfall for a lot of teams, just because obviously it's a big commitment, a lot of driving or flying, however you guys are getting out there, and quick turnarounds, and KC tends to get the advantage that way. So how do you guys come into that series and kind of keep the focus, right off the bat?
I think for me personally, it was just realizing what was on the table for our team. It was winning the South, getting the bye week or the bye round in Buffalo in a few weeks, and it was really just about finishing undefeated, being the better team, showing people that we are the better team and that we have a strong chance to win the championship in Buffalo, and just keeping the focus on what the ultimate goal is. And this series was step one in doing that.
Ethan, I think you're muted.
My bad. So this KC team, not the heaviest Creighton-based team we've ever seen from KC, but there's a little overlap. For you Texas State players that obviously came up on the wrong side of that semifinal, do you guys think about that at all coming into the series?
Not the specific players, but I think just the game in general was on my mind. It's definitely still motivation for me to become a better player and to learn the game better and to just keep getting better every day.
For sure. So, you guys looking into championships, obviously one of the title contenders. Kind of what was the kind of debrief coming out of this series from your coaches? How are you guys looking to attack this championships and kind of your overall mindset going into it?
I think definitely it's just to keep a level head and to keep our eyes on the prize and not let any outside noise kind of bother us or stray us from the path that we want to be on, which is to win the championship in Buffalo.
Awesome. Well, Izzy, thanks so much for taking the time. It was great to talk to you. We're all looking forward to watching you continue in the sport because it's been a joy for the first year, to be sure. And we'll see you at championships.
Of course. Thank you guys for having me.
All right, so we're going to jump over to the North Division to talk about a Minneapolis-Chicago series that ended up being incredibly competitive. Naresh, after game one, messaged myself and Ben in our chat and said, this has a potential to be series of the season. And obviously, in the end, Chicago gets the sweep. But, I mean, every single game was competitive. You can definitely argue that Minneapolis had their chances in really all three. So kind of as we do, let's take it kind of one team at a time. Obviously, is it, Chicago maybe slightly underperforming? Is it Minneapolis kind of overperforming? I'll throw to Ben first. I'm kind of curious about this Minneapolis side of this because they've not been able to compete with Chicago in recent seasons. What looked different to you about them this weekend?
They were able to match Chicago in both facets of the game in a way they haven't in the past. I think they were extremely physical. They stonewalled Chicago on the hoops over and over and over again. Kennedy Murphy almost got killed on a couple murder passes that would have worked, I think, against older Minneapolis teams, but they just stepped out and made the hits. And their beaters, I think, except when Matt Brown was really taking over games for stretches, did a good job keeping pace with the Chicago beaters and doing kind of what we talked about in Washington and Boston, where even if the Chicago beaters played better overall, Minneapolis beaters stepped up and made plays when they could. We saw them spring a couple surprise presses on Chicago to get free turnovers, blitzed them a couple times unexpectedly, stepped up and made exchanges, things like that. And so with all that happening, they frankly should have won the series.
No, yeah. I mean, I think that's totally fair. You mentioned, I think it's very true that in recent years, we haven't been able to see Chicago or Minneapolis keep pace with Chicago in the beating game, and that's kind of just been almost the deciding factor. I thought Nathan Podolsky specifically had a phenomenal weekend, and I think at the times when Matt Brown wasn't taking over the game, it was because Podolsky was often matching him. And like you mentioned, their beaters were also finding ways to be competitive even when they weren't winning the beater games. You mentioned those kind of blitzes. Both Podolsky and Schluter and Cleary were all willing to, with one dodgeball, make a long distance throw on a pass to force a turnover. Like, we're going to end the possession right now. We're not going to sit under our hoop. So I think that was really impressive. But Naresh, what did you like about this Minneapolis performance?
Minneapolis, for me, I think they've almost had this like I don't even know how to explain it. They've had such a spark of energy with the amount of mostly the Creighton core of Joe Goulet and Ryan Mejio coming in and just giving them so much physicality and a dynamic attack in their half court that they haven't had. So when their half court is working, it's when you see Mejio hitting that lane, being able to draw all that attention. And now you're able to see Goulet coming in with that crazy one-hand catch, alley-oop dunks. Like, it's amazing watching Goulet play. Adore that dude. Love watching him play. As soon as they leave the field, half court wise, I think there's a lot of things that just are left on the table. However, I think something they do really well is the fact that they play in transition well. I think every time they get out in transition, they are able to get and generate good looks in ways that they don't do in a half court if Mejio or Goulet are just not on the field. And for me, that's where Minneapolis just needs to take that next step, because we can't continue to see offenses where you're making passes that are either getting dropped, overthrown, or just loopy, right? You can't have these lollipop passes go in the air for 5 seconds that allows the defense to react. And I think that's where, for me, Minneapolis needs to potentially change how they view the game, because I've been a huge proponent of just getting into transition when you don't have an efficient half court, where I think, Ethan, we were talking about it pre-replay. After a certain point, when they were up 5-2, they just scored once the rest of the secret floor. That's the sort of thing where we got on Boston for that. We got on New York for that the past couple of weeks. That's the sort of thing where if we're expecting Minneapolis to compete at the highest levels, which by all means they were able to, because again, they weren't getting blown out. They were matching what Chicago was doing. But if they want to take that game and just put the nail in the coffin, they need to be able to maximize those minutes that they weren't able to do this past week. And I think that's the way they do that is as you were talking about, these beaters are taking more risks. I don't mind if they want to just go full, hey, our defense is going to be, we might take risks, but I don't mind losing one play if we can gain 2 in the long run, right? And you do that by stepping out more aggressively, being a bit more aggressive with your beater presses, chaser presses, so on and so forth. Getting out in transition is when I think Minneapolis looks best. And I can't stand the fact that a lot of teams are playing good to great defense, not getting into transition, only to play poor offense. And now you're just throwing possessions away and letting teams stay in the game, which is what I think we saw this past weekend with Chicago. Even though they were getting blitzed a couple times, they were able to stay in the game until they were able to claw back with enough time where they were able to continually just chip away at the lead, and then they were able to cement their wins.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, I mean, these games were close. This is a team. This was next goal wins in game 1, with Minneapolis getting to that point first and Chicago getting their second. Minneapolis up 5-2 early in game 2, and Minneapolis only lost game 3 by 15 points. This was every single game was up for grabs. And, you know, you mentioned the transition game. Obviously, I mean, that is the world that Max Meyer loves to live in. Every fast start for Minneapolis in this series was on the back of Max Meyer getting out in transition. But then, you know, in later shifts that Meyer would have in the games, they had trouble finding those opportunities as much. But you mentioned half courts, and I really feel like what I was seeing in this series is you could feel the lack of Emma Persons in this Minneapolis program. Obviously, Persons now playing for Boston. Those half courts, they just needed 1 or 2 more people who could pull the strings and let those incredible athletes go to work. But, you know, when people like Mejio and Goulet were forced to be the facilitators and then not being able to be the off-ball threats, same with Meyer, you know, you started seeing things get bogged down a little bit. Ben, what more would you like to see at Minneapolis at championships?
They need a little more versatility in your offense, like you said. There's a couple things. One more ball handler on the field, which is where you feel the lack of Emma, would help a lot just to space things out a little. You know pretty much who's going to do the attacking, or maybe it's going to be one of these two players, generally speaking. A lot of 2-on-4 is happening. One thing that's killing them, I think, and this has been a problem for Minneapolis for a long time, is, and Mejio fixes this, but this is what you saw in Mayos on the field. Ryan Mejio can get downhill, true vertical drive. The rest of their ball handlers kind of want to win horizontally. They want to beat the person on the outside. Then when they get stuck, that pass to the now open cutter on the hoops, instead of you're going vertical and you can open up your body right to them, you're being pushed the wrong way because you tried to beat the person to the side and the ball was going high. It was hanging in the air too long. Chicago was eating it up, or it was getting put in a place where it couldn't be caught. They left multiple goals where the person was wide open on the hoops and they just couldn't get them the ball there. If they can figure a way to make that pass, I mean, that's 3 more goals and they win at the very least game 1, maybe the whole series. Just a little bit more versatility. I would be fine, like Naresh said, if they pushed the pace even more than they did, because their transition was excellent in game 1. Final score 120 to 115. They caught the flag. So that's 8 goals, 4 goals on the half court, 4 goals in transition, right? So their transition offense is just way better than their half court offense. So they can continue to look for that. They could even be a little bit riskier, as we talked about on defense, trying to set up those offensive goals, anything to make it a little easier, because their defense, their physicality, those great beaters is going to keep them in games. But the next step, like Naresh was talking about, is they should be, if we want to think of them the way we talk about Boston, New York, Chicago, San Antonio, they should take these games. That game was there for the taking, and they just kind of left it out there with respect to Chicago, who deserves credit for winning. But like Minneapolis had chances to win all 3 of those games, especially game 1, and just wasn't quite able to get it done. But I think it's small tweaks. I think they're very close. I think they left a lot of points on the field, and we're still 1 goal away from winning.
Yeah, following up on what Ben was saying, I think part of their half-court difficulties is the fact that sometimes their beater setup is just off, right? Where there was one possession that really stuck out to me where Ryan Cleary was on the keeper side of the field while the ball was on the opposite side. More often, if Mejio has the ball, the expectation is Andrews, as the point keeper, will shift over to guard Mejio. Chicago never did that. They let Noyes Ostra step up as the point defender, and Noyes had a wide open run at Mejio, who did not have beater protection, didn't have a true chaser open because the hoop defender on the strong side was just running right at the only available option, and Andrews was on the opposite side guarding the potential pass, and Cleary, with the only dodgeball in hand, wasn't there to protect Mejio. And I think there are ways to get Mejio the ball in a space where he can do damage. And I think they just didn't make those adjustments where when you don't have control like that, you have to put your beaters in a space where they can control the maximum amount of space. And I think if you're matching your beater with the point keeper and you're not moving the ball to get the ball to where it needs to go to maximize the spaces, you're just fundamentally letting Chicago dictate how the pace of the game went. And to be fair, in that play, Cleary beats out Noyes Ostra, gets control back. However, all of that, it's moot because Noyes created the turnover. DME gets the ball, runs it in transition. Again, all of this is Chicago doesn't score, but the problem is the process of what they were trying to do was flawed, in my opinion, which they got lucky that they didn't get scored on. But I think that sort of thing where they're letting possessions just be thrown away by faulty setup, I think is something they can't afford to do, especially if we're expecting them to go up against a Boston at Champs, who, again, as we've said, they haven't had too much luck against a Max and Lulu beater pair in the past.
Yeah, I mean, on the opposite end of it, and to your point about like, can they look for more transitions? A play that stands out to me from game 2 is a Chicago offense where one of their 2 balls ended up on the ground from a tap beat, but was being gathered by their beater. And at that exact moment, Minneapolis got a stop. Podolski saw the opportunity, forced one beater into a throwback, then the other beater into the throwback. So suddenly there were no dodgeballs in Chicago's hands. Meyer took off and scored. They couldn't get control out of that. Obviously, the throwbacks were successful, but they got a goal. And, that's in a series like this so much more valuable. So, finding opportunities like that. Obviously, when you mention chaser, beater communications, obviously one little mistake really hurt them at the end of game 1 where they had the no dodgeball transition opportunity. Narveson, I think, miscalculated where the dodgeballs were. threw at Walters as Walters was able to put a fist up, as also Walters' teammate was rolling them the ball to go play defense, and the Chasers weren't able to capitalize on time at what was briefly a no dodgeball situation. That could have been an extended no dodgeball situation if they were able to play it well. So, like you said, it's just in the margins right now. But as I think we all, agree, this team is on the edge. Obviously, they got the seeking as well. Goulet made 2 catches this weekend. If this Minneapolis-Boston series comes to fruition, obviously Minneapolis finally got that Boston team a couple years ago in Iowa. This could be a hype Saturday night series if that's where we get to. Moving over to the Chicago side, because we haven't even talked about the winners of this series yet. We finally got the full roster, the full strength Chicago. I apologize if they were missing 1 or 2 people. I don't want to slight anybody, but much closer to the roster we're expecting them to top out with. Ben, was it everything you wanted it to live up to be?
It was the players we wanted to see, but it looked like it was the first time we were all seeing them together, right? The lines looked a little like they were still feeling things out, and this is where Chicago prides itself on its depth and doing those very fast rotations, but it was like situations where a line comes in, got to play 2 plays, neither of which went the way they wanted, and then they have to sub out because that's how they like to play. But it can be hard to build rhythm in that sense, and you really got that feeling with those lines of people who don't have much experience before this summer playing together. The line that's Matthew Troy and Justin Cole together haven't played together before this summer. Riley Andrews and DME haven't really played together before this summer. Whereas when you saw the players who have played a lot together in the past, Kennedy and Liam and Nathan and Ben Peachy, the chemistry looked a lot better, and that was where they were able to generate points, especially in game 1 when the points were really hard to come by. It was those lines of players who have played together for years and years that were coming up with the goals they needed. And so obviously, hopefully this weekend goes a long ways towards improving that chemistry. They have a few more practices between now and then, but it looked like a team where we have all these great pieces and a lot of them made great individual players, but they still seem to be figuring out how it all fits together. And we're very late in the game for that. Obviously, a lot of talent. Talent is the most important thing at the end of the day, great coaching staff, but we need to see them be more coherent 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, they definitely, lived up to what they said as that, we trust our entire team. Because when it came to next goal wins, it was Matt Troy that was jumping on the rebound. And, I think if we made a list of every quadball player on this team from that roster, he might not break the top 7, 8, but they trusted him to be on the field at the big moment. He came up with the big play. And, but like you said, at some point, this team needs to figure out what their identity is in terms of who's going to be playing with who in those big moments, because you need those decisions made. Naresh, how do you feel about this performance?
Yeah, I think I agree with the disjointedness at certain points of what Chicago threw out there. But my personal opinion is I think that's okay, right? In terms of, it's not great that it's 2 weeks before champs and we're talking about this, but I think it's also the sheer fact that I'm also on record saying you need to play your depth so that when you're day 2 of champs, they're not afraid of the big game. They're not afraid to be out there in these crunch time moments. And I think that sort of thing is something that I'm okay with in terms of that. I think these players have played long enough and are potentially good enough to be able to make it work in the next 2 weeks to really figure out what works for them and go from there. So that's like the glass half full opinion, I think, in terms of the roster usage. I love the fact that they go through all their lines and force teams to always play against fresh legs. So I think that's fantastic. My big thing is when this team is stationary, this team looks like the Indianapolis intensities from like way back when, where they're just standing in place, throwing these super long passes and no one's moving. But when they are moving, when they are just hitting those lanes, getting everyone involved, now there were multiple points where they had the Minneapolis defense completely baffled, rotating left and right horizontally. There was one play where, obviously it goes into the chemistry aspect, where Digman passes it off. Kennedy gets the ball, passes it off to Digman. Digman passes it to Peachy on the left side. Ends up being a no dodgeball. As soon as Digman throws it off to the left side, it's a small hoop, hits the lane to the medium hoop, and because of the way the pass went, Minneapolis Chasers completely over-rotated to guard the pass in Peachy. Peachy just found a wide-open cutter in Digman. Digman scored. That sort of constant movement, I think, helps what Chicago is able to do on the field. However, there are many times where I'm just like, this looks boring. And that's something that's something I don't say about Chicago's offense in the past when they were executing at a really high level. And I think that's where if they can get back into that, hey, let's keep the ball moving in a brisk, fast-paced to be able to capitalize on our momentum is, I think, where they will do wonders. Defensively, I was pretty happy the fact that they showed multiple looks, then they continue to show multiple looks. It showed a half court. And I think, again, I shouted this person out in the last time we did Chicago, but Ariana Zhang stood out for their defense again. Making hits, being in the right spaces for such a young player to be able to do that, phenomenal. Love watching them play on defense. But again, right now, it's a bunch of what Ben was saying and y'all were saying. Offensively, it just feels off. But I think that precedence has shown that they can rebound. We'll have to see if that actually happens come champs.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the thing is, we can talk about, the deep roster of Team USA and former Team USA and Team USA level players they have in the quad ball game. But the thing, two names that, I feel like have not been said enough when it comes to talking about this team and its ceiling is Ali Peachy and Emma Vasquez, because neither one of them, Ali due to injury, Emma because they're just not on roster this season, are going to be playing with this team at championship. Those are two Team USA players in a 3-max era who aren't with this team, who were core to how this offense that you were talking about that was so free-flowing tick. Ali Peachy, was, the cutter that was always open, that was always a threat to score, and Vasquez was always capable of playing with the ball in their hands. And, when, Kenny Murphy's out there, pulling the strings, the offense still has a bit more of that flow. We were talking about the Ben Peachy, Digman, line with her, and that line was still flowing. The passes were still moving. And, you mentioned a young player like Ariana Zhang, and I was literally, before you even said it, I was going to say, really impressed with the defensive play, but it's not quite there. I mean, and it's no shame to say a young player is not yet, an Emma Vasquez or an Ali Peachy. But I think that's what this team is going to need to build. Kenny Murphy might have to make some tough decisions about playing herself a little bit more to, open up how free flowing this offense is going to be. Tricky to do as a playing head coach. So, it's going to be interesting to see what the decisions they make. Go ahead, Rash.
Yeah. Something else I did want to mention about the half court of Chicago's was the fact that I don't know if they did this on purpose, but the amount of they set up in a kite formation almost where they had Kennedy up top, a driver. The one play I'm specifically referring to was Kennedy up top, Riley Andrews on the right side, and then they had I forget, I don't know who it was. The film wasn't clear, but they had someone else on the left side cut across almost like an Iverson cut, if anyone's familiar, where they just cut through the middle of the court field and just set a screen. In this case, it would be a screen, and then they would be setting a screen. Riley would use the screen to come into what initially was the weak side, and now you've overloaded the original strong side with multiple chasers. I love that setup because if you actually look at how much stuff opens up, if the reason why it didn't work was one, Noyes should have made that tap beat on the non-point keeper defender a lot earlier because they were so late on the tap. That allowed Nate Podolsky to be able to just blow up the entire play completely. However, if that tap happens earlier, that offensive setup that Chicago was utilizing, I really like that. And I think those sort of setups, and there was another play where I saw Ariana Zhang and Liam Zock double screening, which we don't see often, setting a double screen for Digman to hit the lane and take a shot. Diggy missed, but again, it's the different ideas that I think that they're trying to maximize and utilize that we're seeing from them that we're not seeing from these other teams that has me slightly more upbeat about what they can potentially do because they're trying things. They're utilizing things. Again, I don't know if they're doing it on purpose or if they're just lucking into it, but there are certain setups that I was like, I've never seen that on a quad ball pitch before. And that looked interesting. And if they can piece that together, if they can work it out, they have a ton of really interesting concepts that I personally really liked.
No, I think it's certainly fair. Ben, on the beating side, because we talked about their quad ball players a lot. I mean, I think we got those moments of Matt Brown that we were expecting. But I think overall there was a lot of parity in this series. Do you think this was just like we were talking about, kind of some step ups by some big Minneapolis beaters like Podolsky, or do you think it was just kind of a underwhelming performance overall by the rest of the Chicago beater core?
I think the Chicago beater core outside of Matt Brown has a history of playing kind of to the level of their opponents. I'm not in the past. We would have said playing down. I think Minneapolis played really well this weekend, so I don't want to say playing down, but they didn't elevate above them. So I don't think this rules out that they can play better at championships. I remember last year I was talking to some of the Boston beaters after they lost in the semifinals, and they were extremely mad watching the finals against New York. Because like if Chicago's beaters played like this against us, we'd be in the finals right now, right? Chicago is very capable of elevating to the level of the opponent they're going to face. But I think catch them on the wrong day, get them caught off guard, which I think they were very caught off guard by how good Minneapolis's beaters were. Then they look, relatively average. So I think the potential is still there. I think there's tweaks, just like we talked about the chasers, to who plays with who they can do, and what beater pairs play with what chaser lines is something they could be even more rigorous about, playing the kind of quote unquote weaker beaters with the stronger chasers and vice versa to try to balance things out. There's things they can do, but this is a team that has done this in the past, right? I think even the year they made that surprise run to the finals, their beaters did not look like this crazy unit in the regular season, and they looked fantastic at championships. So we just got to see what happens.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, credit to the staff. Anytime things were going awry, this team knew that they just needed to put Matt Brown back on the field. And I mean, that's important recognition. We see teams not make those decisions correctly in big moments at times. So, go to your best when you need those minutes. And Brown usually delivered. Obviously, like we said, Minneapolis did do a good job of negating him at times as well. Before we get to our interview, I just kind of want both of your opinions on both teams. So my two questions would be, assuming we do get Minneapolis, Boston, who you got? And then where Chicago 1, 2, or 3, or lower than that in your league-wide rankings? Naresh, you can go first.
I have Minneapolis over Boston. I think Minneapolis showed me that they're a top 4 team in the league. If I'm gonna say that Chicago is 2-3, and we saw Minneapolis actively outplay them for 2/3 of the series, for me, I think Minneapolis is up there for potentially a 3-4. I'm gonna say 4 just because, again, to be fair, they still got swept. But I think Minneapolis is above Boston. So that's my personal take on that. And in terms of Chicago, I think right now they're in that, again, I think they're 3. I think New York still talent-wise outpaces them as an overall cohesive unit. But again, if they bring it together, I think they can definitely match up well against any of these teams. But for me, it's a San Antonio, New York, Chicago, Minneapolis, and then potentially it's like that's the tier 1, and then Washington, Boston, and maybe Houston in the tier 2, and then everyone else tier 3.
Ben, where are you on those two questions?
I think Chicago is definitely in my internal rankings behind New York and San Antonio. I would have them solidly above everyone else, although Minneapolis is close, as evidenced by this weekend, right? Minneapolis versus Boston, I think, is going to be very close. I think what we were reminded of this weekend by Minneapolis is they have the seeker edge in that matchup with Joe Goulet out there, and I think that could be the difference. We got to see Minneapolis prove they can finish a close game after not doing this weekend, but Boston has that same problem, right, where they do have that nice upset over New York on the docket for the season, but they struggled to close out Washington in situations where they should have closed them out too. So I think that series is really close. I think it's basically a coin flip, so I would go with the team with the better seeker. But like we talked about every week, pretty much, even when Boston didn't play, Max and Lulu's names come up. That's the problem that every team that plays against Boston has to have an answer for, and we got to see if Minneapolis's beaters can replicate what they did this weekend against kind of the best pair in the history of the sport.
All right. Well, good transition since you mentioned that seeker. We are going to go to our second guest, the chaser and seeker for the Minneapolis Monarchs, Joe Goulet. Joe, thanks so much for taking the time tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, obviously, it's always tough to take positives out of an 0-3 sweep, but obviously you guys were very competitive. What I know, because I've been talking to Cody for years at this point, I know that every year you guys want the North Division. So anything short of a North Division title, you guys aren't considering a success. But, based on how the weekend goes, were you overall happy with at least the product you guys were putting on the field for most of the weekend?
I would say so. Yeah, you guys have touched on it a lot over the past little stream here. Even though we took 3 losses, I consider the weekend as a whole a win. I think this was the best possible series we could have had leading up to champs in terms of an opponent. Chicago made us kind of hone in on things we need to improve. And quite frankly, like you guys have talked about, like In our Detroit series, we were primarily half court. This series, we were primarily transition based for a lot of our goals. So if we can kind of pull everything together and shake up the stack a little bit at champs is obviously the goal.
So you've been in and out of this program through the years, and I think when you first got started, it was kind of when you guys were winning all those titles. But it really was back then. It was University of Minnesota and Friends. It was basically like you and HBB and 23 players from the University of Minnesota. That's kind of changed now. I mean, obviously, we talked about Podolski's impact, coming from another program. A bunch of Creighton players, now involved in the program. So, kind of what's that transition like been in the program to kind of go from that very kind of that lovable all Minnesota team to now like a real MLQ program that's taking from a lot of different talent from a lot of different places?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you say, like just having different ideologies about the game, like having people from different schools, but also a lot of the kids that you just talked about, including myself, used to play for Kansas City down in the South. Little bit different game down there, a little bit tougher, a little bit rougher. And then you kind of bring that up to Minneapolis, where their beating core has been pretty much the same core group of people for the past God knows how many years. But taking some rough and tumble chasers and putting them with some smart beaters is bound for some success.
So to kind of take me through what your guys' huddle was after game one, because obviously the opportunities were there. It seemed like a few communications breakdowns, a couple plays not going your way, but kind of what was the overall feeling about kind of what went wrong in those last few minutes of game one?
Sure. Yeah, we were, I believe, up, if not caught up to golden goal. Had a few plays that didn't go our way at the very end. I don't know if the stream caught it. I walked off in a little fit. I'm sure other players did as well.
Don't you worry, Joe. We all saw the broom throw.
Oh, perfect. That's what I was waiting on. But I think the huddle as a whole started quite mad. Some people were like, hey, we were just golden goal with Chicago. This is the team we've been wanting to beat. We're right here. We have 2 more games literally right now. Let's take it back to them.
Yeah, and you obviously heard us talk a lot about kind of your transition offense versus your, half court offense. What do you think's, not quite clicking as well as it could be? I mean, we've seen what both you and Ryan, but also what players like, Max Meyer can do in those situations. Obviously, it wasn't really working this weekend. So what are you guys trying to improve on before championship?
Sure. I think especially what I've been trying to get our, let's say, less experienced kids like the CC Voth, Brady Charles, Danae Herring. What I've been trying to get them to do is just when they have the ball in their hands, even if it's in practice, if it's not necessarily the right decision, just make a decision and run with it and just go. And I think that kind of came to fruition this weekend where we were so focused on the transition game, get out and run. If you watch a lot of these possessions, if we get like a quick turnover, whether it's myself or Max Meyer or Ben Z running the length of the field, basically running like a post route, we were so worried about getting out in transition and getting out and running that we were making our decisions too quickly, especially in the half court. Everybody was trying to make some things happen that weren't there or trying to rush a play when it wasn't quite fully developed yet, I think.
For sure. Obviously, I'm sure you're not in all of like the beater strategy talks, but I did notice that, as I mentioned earlier on the defense, like your beaters were willing to be turrets and make really long beats without divulging all your strategy 2 weeks before champs. Was that like a specific goal you guys had as like a strategy going into the series?
I wouldn't necessarily say it was a specific like bullet point on our docket for the weekend. I do think that with somebody like Ben Schluter, who has probably the strongest arm in the game, and then Poto and Cleary, who love beating with their feet, the range that our beaters were able to kind of occupy was definitely put on display this weekend, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. So, I'm very lucky. Back-to-back weeks, I got to do an interview with a shooter, and there's not that many shooters in the sport anymore. And I used to be a shooter, so I love talking about shooting. So I want to know, as someone who last week I was talking to John Gaffigan. He's been shooting for 10 years. Back then we all shot. But you're obviously much younger in the sport, but still found a way to kind of work shooting into your game. So with all these zones and everything, what are you looking for when you try to find these opportunities to like get out shots, in half court offenses?
Sure. Yeah. I think for me, it's, I don't want to give too much away, but if I can see that somebody is not keeping their hands up, this is going to be like a coach's dream right here. If they don't have their hands up,
I'm going to make all my Harvard kids, watch this.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah. Giving back to the game. If you have your hands down, I'm going to shoot it right by your ear. Like you can't get your hand up no matter how, quick you think you are. I'm going to shoot it right over your head. And quite frankly, there's, not a lot you can do except have your dang hand up to begin with. So I think that's definitely something. And then as I've kind of matured in the game and kind of come to understand how people shift, whether or not they're getting like picked or beat out, seeing rotations for years at this point, you can kind of tell where people are going to move. You can see it a little bit in our Detroit game, where we were making that beat out on the rightmost hoop. They're shifting over. That leaves middle hoop wide open. There's nobody there, so it seems a little like cut and dry, but quite frankly, even if there's somebody on the hoop, well, obviously shoot on an open hoop, but if there is somebody on the hoop, they're only taking up so much space. You can pick your spot and then rack up some points that way.
You say cut and dry, but nobody's doing it, so I'm happy to talk about it. Naresh, go ahead.
Yeah, Joe, I don't want you to have to go and delve into further state secrets, but I need to know, and I've been wanting to ask you this for years. How many times have you been yelled at to use both hands? And subsequently, how many times have you had to tell your teammates not to follow what you do?
It's probably a weekly thing at Monarchs practice. I'm not going to lie. And back at Creighton, it was, well, actually, Curtis kind of encouraged it. He was like, everybody use two hands. And I'd raise my hand and be like, unless you're Joe. So I got away with it there. But at Minneapolis practices, it's Poto and Cody definitely telling me to use two hands. And I've been, humble enough to tell the kids hey, use two hands, even if you think you don't need them. But
fair enough. Appreciate it.
It was great in the Creighton years where, because you were doing it, some of your teammates were trying to do it, but they couldn't do it as cleanly. It was perfect for someone who was coaching against Creighton back then. Let me tell you. So obviously you said kind of an angry meeting after game one, but obviously you guys got to a place where you accepted that it was this overall, successful weekend. So what are the overall vibes on the team? I don't know if you probably haven't had a practice yet since then, but what are the overall vibes as far as you can tell now as you have a quick turnaround in the championships?
Yeah, I think we're hungry. Like I said, we're looking to shake up the stack a little bit. I appreciate you guys, putting us somewhere just below that top tier teams, 4 or 5, somewhere in there. But we're looking to, if it is Boston, obviously, take it to them. Not a team we've seen yet this year. A team we saw 2 years in Iowa, I believe. And I think we're going to have a few practices before we, head to MSP to get up to New York. But I think we'll definitely hone in on our half court, obviously, where you can kind of figure out our transition play from this past weekend, but kind of hone in on our deficiencies of this past weekend and bring a full-fledged, ready-to-go roster to New York.
Awesome. Yeah, I was going to ask, but maybe it doesn't fully apply to you because I know you haven't been with the team the whole time. Obviously Chicago is your guys' rivals, but you kind of have a mini championship rivalry with Boston at this point. You guys have played them at least 3 or 4 times at this point in championship. So and usually it has not gone your way outside that Iowa one. So I'm really interested if some of the veterans who've been in all those games are a little extra hungry for a potential Boston matchup.
Yeah. For me personally, I don't, Boston, it's whatever. I definitely just want to take it to Emma Persons and make sure that we get that win under our belt.
For sure. Awesome. Well, Joe, thanks so much for taking the time tonight. We're really excited to watch you guys at championships in a couple weeks.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So that is going to do it for another episode of MLQ Replay. We are right up against the end of the season now. Just one series left coming up Saturday night. Detroit versus Cleveland. Winner gets the 3 seed in the North. Loser gets the 4 seed. really big implications for who gets a much easier path, potentially getting out of the lower bracket in just 12 days now, 11 days at MLQ Championship in Buffalo, New York. Myself, Naresh, Ben will all be there. Obviously, our guests are going to be there, as well as our producer, Miguel. We hope you guys join. If not, we hope you guys tune in. We've got a lot of exciting content planned. But yeah, as always, thanks everybody for watching. We hope you enjoyed. Best of luck.